Hello, my friends. This is Lynda Lippin, and welcome to the Pilates Goddess podcast. Hello, everybody. It's Lynda Lippin here, and thank you once again for coming back to the Pilates Goddess podcast. In today's episode, I'm talking about Pilates for lower back pain. And I specifically chose this topic because so many people come to Pilates because they have lower back pain or think they can't do Pilates because they have lower back pain. And I thought that I would address some of the concerns people might have about their back pain and what Pilates can and can't do for them. Because let's face it, we see all kinds of shit on the internet that we can cure back pain and we can do all of these other things. And that, my friends, is bullshit. Okay. But what Pilates can definitely do is teach you how to move better, balance out your muscles a little bit, which may help and often does help alleviate that lower back pain. So first of all, let's look at why we have lower back pain to begin with. And I'm going to talk a little bit about postural issues, and we'll talk a little bit about the issues of sitting so much, and also the issues of technique and looking down a lot, and what the forward head position actually does to our lower backs, which is almost more of a concern in many ways than what it does to our necks and shoulders. So this human spine has 24 vertebrae. 12 of those vertebrae are attached to your rib cage. Just 12, right? We got 12 ribs, we have 12 thoracic vertebrae, and your entire rib cage is your thoracic spine. Above your thoracic spine or above your rib cage, we have 7 cervical vertebrae. Below, we have 5 lumbar vertebrae, and then the sacrum, which, will be referred to as like S1. Sometimes if you have a very low disc herniation, they'll talk about L5S1, which would be the joint between the lowest lumbar vertebrae and then your sacrum. And then there's the coccyx, which is our kind of vestigial tails. And that's a little tiny bone that kind of tucks in under your butt below the sacrum. Now, ideally, for the human body to be able to be upright and kind of balance correctly against gravity, the way our spines are made is to curve. And what's very interesting about that is that Joseph Pilates, if you read a lot of his writings, thought that the spine should be flat or straight. But really what he was looking at in the human body was a lot of kind of postural deviations and issues. So if you ever have a chance to go onto YouTube and do just a search for vintage Pilates videos, if you go onto Instagram, there's a few accounts that are sharing old videos that we have of Joseph Pilates teaching humans. You will see all kinds of interesting postures coming into his Pilates studio, right? You'll see even young people who are super skinny with no muscle tone and their back's really round. You see a lot of dancers who are dealing, with their own personal issues in terms of posture and pain. You see some opera singers, you see some other interesting folks. But when you look at them, you notice that some folks have a really hyperarched back, some folks have a large rib cage, some, including Joe Pilates himself. But in all of them, he really focuses on getting their spines moving, on getting their spines long, and on getting their spines pretty stable. And that's really what we want to be looking at in terms of back pain. Interestingly enough, Romana Kryzanowska, who was the teacher who took over Joseph Pilates' studio, used to say, bad back, keep flat. But she didn't mean flat as in no spine curve. What she meant was not rounded forward, not in forward flexion, not hyperextended backward, not rotated, not side bent, just in the middle. I don't use the term neutral. If you go back through my episodes, you'll see an early episode called The Myth of Neutral Spine. Because we're constantly breathing, because as adults, we've already got some postural deviations and, some other issues, we are never really in a defined kind of neutral spine, right? You've got people with scoliosis, you've got people with forward head, you've got all kinds of stuff going on. So I kind of prefer, in a very real way, the simplicity of that language of flat versus bent forward or bent backwards. It makes it easier, and it actually makes it easier for your clients to understand, because then you're not sitting there, trying to explain to them what exactly neutral is. I've spoken before about, clients who have been told that neutral is that they should always have their lower backs lifted, 1 to 2 inches off the mat when they're supine. That is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard in my entire life, or one of them anyway. So when we look at the spine, what you want to be thinking about in general is that if you lift up from a heavy seat. So what I like to tell my clients is, if you're sitting, right, sit on a chair where you can get your feet on the floor, and then really shift your weight into your sits bones so that you're kind of evenly weighted on both of your thighs, and your weight is off of your tailbone and shifted a little bit forward onto your sits bones. This will pretty much put your pelvis where you want it to be, where your hip bones and your pubic bones are in the same horizontal plane. And then once you're in that position, you just think about lifting up through your spine, not forward anywhere, just up. And as you lift the spine, what you're going to notice is that as you lift up your lower back does indeed move a little bit forward as it moves up. And it's supposed to, right? If you look at a skeleton from the side, you see that the lumbar spine curves a little bit forward for support. And that is because the thoracic spine has to curve backward, because you've got the rib cage there, and you've got, lungs and hearts and important internal organs inside of that rib cage. And then if you keep lengthening up kind of through the lower back and through the spine and through the rib cage, then you will kind of find out naturally that your head lifts a little bit, your chin lifts a little bit if you're gazing forward, and that indeed your neck goes a little bit forward and up as well, kind of mirroring what's happening in your lower back. And then once you get to that position, just, breathe deeply now, because once you're in that kind of long, lengthened sitting position, you can really get some air in. You may have some tight spots in your back. You might have some tight spots around your diaphragm, around your rib cage. I understand that, but you're in the best position to get some good breaths in if you can. Just inhaling and exhaling, and just feeling how nice that is to be in that long, lifted, lengthened position. Okay. Now, from this position, Obviously, you could drop your head forward and you could round your spine forward. You can come back up. You could bend backward a little bit, kind of again lifting up a little bit more, letting that lumbar spine move a little more forward to help assist that back bend. You can also go side to side in this direction. You can also rotate your head and ribs in either direction without really moving your pelvis and your hips a whole lot. Now, if you come out of that long lifted spine and kind of slump back down into the position that you might normally sit in, I want you to come back to that position and I want you to start to try to breathe again. And I want you to notice how your breathing might be a little bit constricted in this position. Because if you're like most of us, you've tucked your pelvis under a little, not even intentionally. And now your lumbar spine is a little bit flatter and kind of sitting back to the back of your chair. That means your shoulders are rolled a tiny bit forward. Yeah. Your head's now a tiny bit forward. And it's actually harder to take a deep breath. And if you go to actually turn your body to one side, you're going to notice how much harder it is to move your rib cage, because now your bones are kind of not in the ideal place to handle that amount of rotation. Now, if you're a golfer or a tennis player or do anything that requires that upper back rotation, this is super important for you, right? Because what happens is if you keep trying to turn your back or turn your rib cage and your head while you're in this kind of schlumpy, flat lumbar position, you're going to notice that it doesn't feel great. And you might be getting a little bit of strain through your lower back right there. And if you engage in golf or tennis where you are repetitively going into that position, you're going to end up with some back issues. Okay. Regardless of the cause of the lower back pain, there is nobody who is going to be hurt by finding that long lifted middle ground for their spines. And if you want to call this for somebody their neutral, whatever, feel free. It's not my favorite language. If you want to think about this as your neutral spine, feel free. Again, I don't find that to be the most illuminating way to talk about these things. So once you've kind of found this middle ground of this long lifted spine, I would like you to think about taking that long lifted spine into some different positions. So maybe you stand up and you keep the spine long and lifted. Yeah. Maybe you sit down and stand up a few times, i.e. do a few squats. Keep the spine long and lifted as you move your legs. Maybe start to move your arms around. Do some arm circles, do some shoulder shrugs, some shoulder circles while you're in this lifted position. And then maybe try all of those movements again when you're kind of slumped down in your chair and not kind of worried about anything. And I promise you, they will feel very, very different. Now, you may be sitting there going, but Lynda, what about the scooping and what about the navel to spine and what about all of that? And what I'm going to tell you is that in my view, as somebody who has been practicing Pilates for about 35 years now and teaching it for over 33, is that when you pull your abdominals in and up, you kind of somewhat pull your belly button up towards your spine. But you're not trying to move your spine necessarily with that, right? So what a lot of folks do is they come into, say, a deep powerhouse scoop of navel to spine, and they automatically flatten their lower backs down. And they automatically go into a slight pelvic tuck or a slight posterior pelvic tilt to hold that, right? And that is precisely what we don't want. So what I invite you to think about in terms of your abdominals is I would like you to think about your abdominals as wrapping around your entire torso. okay? So that your abdominals are going from your diaphragm under your rib cage to your pelvic floor muscles at the bottom of your pelvis. And then there's 4 layers of abdominal muscle that are wrapping around the sides. So the transverse abdominis is the most internal of these, and that actually attaches at your lumbar spine and attaches to your diaphragm and your rib cage and wraps around from the lower back all the way to the fronts of the body to that line that you sometimes see in the middle of the abdominals called the linea alba, where all the abdominal muscles join. On top of that, we have 2 layers of obliques that are attaching the ribs to the pelvis at slightly different angles. And then over the top of all of that, we have the rectus abdominis, or the 6-pack, which is basically a sheath of muscle that attaches your breastbone, attaches just under your rib cage at the front, right under your breastbone, to your pubic bones. And that's almost like the armor muscle, that rectus. So it can be somewhat involved in pretty much every single movement, but the muscles underneath are almost more important to our function than that rectus abdominis is. So if you think about this seriously, this corset or this girdle of muscle that goes around the body, and then you've got back muscles on top of that, and you've got, rib muscle and all these other things coming out over that, then if you have that image of how the spine curves, and then you have that image of a corset kind of going around the body, that's the image that I want you to really maintain, right? Is that it's not just pulling front to back. It's pulling in and up around the entire torso and pulling the abdominal muscles up a little bit under the rib cage. And then as you breathe, getting as deep breaths as you can. That, my friends, is the way to go. Now, while you're doing an exercise, you may notice that it gets a little bit harder to breathe. And that's because for the exercise, you might be flattening your back or rounding your back or going into rotation or doing something else. But in those positions, you don't live in those positions, and it might be a little bit harder to breathe in those positions, and that's okay. It's still good to try it. Now, because we sit a lot, and we used to sit a lot before 2020, and most people are sitting a lot more after 2020 simply because we're working from home, we are home more, maybe we're more scared. I've been teaching Pilates, we've gone through several paradigms of where back pain comes from. And really what I want you to know is, from the pain experts, no one really knows where back pain comes from. Just know that. They have done cadaver studies on folks that have like tons of disc herniations and stenosis with people who never reported back pain. And then they have, done cadaver studies on folks who consistently reported severe pain and had very little pathology that they could see in their spines. So who knows? But there's another couple of muscle groups that I want to talk about because they also can contribute to back pain. Now, one of those is the iliopsoas complex, which are the primary hip flexors. And I hear many clients talking about their tight psoas or their psoas causing their back pain. So here's what I want you to think about. Imagine, just picture your own body, okay? Picture the inside of your thigh bones, okay? Kind of at your inner thigh. And there's a muscle that attaches to the very inside of that thigh bone at the top. and then comes up and attaches to every single lumbar vertebrae and your 12th thoracic vertebrae. And what this big muscle does is it pulls your knee in towards your chest. It lifts your leg up. This psoas muscle exists on both sides, right? And attaches on both sides of your spine. And once again, I'm reminding you that it attaches to all the lumbar vertebrae. So if you've ever done any exercise where, say, you were on your back and your legs were up in the air and you started to lower your legs away from your body and you felt your lower back start to pull forward with your legs, that means that your abdominals and your other muscles are not quite strong enough to hold your pelvis back and hold your spine in place as you go to lengthen the legs away. So the psoas muscles, the hip flexors, start to pull your spine forward. So strong hip flexors are a good thing. Remember, my friends, that tight doesn't always mean strong, and loose doesn't always mean weak. So what we want are strong hip flexors that are able to rest when we can, that are able to lengthen, and that are able to shorten. If we sit a lot, and especially if we sit a lot kind of slumped down with our lower backs rounding, you can imagine that those hip flexor muscles are going to get a little dicey, right? They get tight, they get stuck in one position. That's when you go to stand up and like your back kind of tweaks because your hip flexors don't lengthen enough as you stand. They don't do it quickly enough because they're so tight from sitting. The other muscle group that comes in here is actually the glutes and the hamstrings. Okay. So imagine that if your hip flexor muscles are super tight, so they're kind of pulling your pelvis forward, and they don't really want to extend your hip or lengthen the front of your body or allow your leg to go behind you without pinching your back. Your glutes or your butt muscles and your hamstrings at the back of your legs start to not work as well. And especially if you're sitting a lot, what happens is you get very tight by your knees, behind your knees. So your calves and your hamstrings where they cross the back of your knee get super tight. And then that overstretches the very top of your hamstrings and your gluteal muscles a lot. So you end up in this perfect storm where your lumbar spine is not stable because every time you go to stand up or move your legs into extension or behind you, you start to move your lumbar spine. Okay. And then your hamstrings and your glutes aren't strong enough to stabilize your pelvis and your spine as you're doing these movements. That's why exercises like bridging are so important. That's why exercises like squats, standing all the way up, are so important. Okay. That's why, frankly, Joseph Pilates counseled working all the muscles, working all the parts, and getting them all to be evenly strong, evenly flexible. So, if you're thinking about doing Pilates for your lower back pain, I encourage you to do that. But I also encourage you to be careful. Start at the beginning with more exercises that work on stabilizing your body and allowing you to feel the length of your spine, and then moving your arms and legs in different ways with that stable torso. Then you can start to graduate a little bit into flexion and extension, maybe a little side bending and rotation. But again, you don't want to work through kind of burning lower back pain. So you really want to either be with a teacher who can watch what you're doing and hear what you're feeling and help you shift how you're moving so that it feels better, and that you're strengthening and stretching the appropriate parts. Or you really need to be aware and be listening to your body. And if you're using a DVD, or you're doing one of the myriad of, free workouts on YouTube, which is fine, by the way. I mean, I've got plenty up there, including work for back pain. And I'll put some links to those in the show notes. Be aware of your own body and be aware of kind of where your spine is and what your spine is doing. Okay. There's a whole lot of back stretching movements in Pilates, which at the beginning are not going to be so great. And frankly, if you have kind of back or spine pathologies, you may want to leave them out altogether. This is where working with an instructor comes in handy, because we're the ones who will say, do this, not that, and explain to you why you want to do this and not that. So remember that there's like 500 exercises at least in the Pilates system. That does not include modifications and variations. That does not include work with props. And there's a lot, in fact, that 500 exercises does not encompass, because Pilates has grown. And the meat of the Pilates method has actually grown. But there is tons of Pilates that will help your lower back pain. You just have to be somewhat knowledgeable about what you're doing. So I will put some links in the show notes to some videos that will help you find an appropriate pelvic position, okay? And that will help you go through some exercises that are pre-Pilates that are perfectly appropriate for beginning Pilates folks, or even folks who have been doing Pilates for a long time, but who are currently experiencing acute lower back pain. Now, and sometimes I think this should go without saying, but then I have, run into people who don't even think about it. If you have lower back pain and it's ongoing and you're not sure where it comes from, you need to go and get it checked out. Make sure where it's coming from before you start trying to exercise to deal with it. Because, there could be a disc herniation or something else going on in your spine. So, always be cleared by a medical professional to start exercising and to start moving. And if you can, and you're going to that medical professional, get some of their advice on the movements that you should be doing more of and the movements that you should be doing less of, and share those with your trainers and your Pilates teachers. All right, everybody. Thank you so, so much once again for joining me. I'm going to encourage you again, like I do every single episode, to go onto Spotify or go into Apple Podcasts on your iPhones, and please subscribe, rate, and leave a written review. Thanks so much again for listening, and I'll talk to you next time. Thank you so much for listening to the Pilates Goddess podcast. Music brought to you by Nerd Salad. Please leave a review on Apple Podcasts, especially if you liked it. And please like, share, and subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thanks.